Hello, everyone. Welcome to Timeless. In today's story, we're visiting a young man named Robby. As a child, Robby lived during a dark period of American history, a time when Africans were bought, sold, and treated as property, Antebellum South. In this story, Robby is reflecting on an important moment from his childhood and writes a riveting story about friendship and love, and how small acts of courage can inspire hope and change. This is Timeless, and we proudly present Robby's story, Just 10 Words.
I sat on my bed, awake and anxious, looking out my open window as I sweltered in the late summer heat. The humid air felt sticky as rays of dim moonlight shimmered through the curtains, giving them a ghostly glow as they gently rippled in the breeze. I could hear the crickets chirping as the putrid aroma of damp soil invaded my room. The smell nauseated me, but I didn't want to close the window because of the heat. I wiped the sweat off my brow and turned to the clock standing on my bedside table. It read 5 minutes to midnight. Immediately, I felt uneasy. Nervously, I averted my gaze from the clock and looked at my desk across the room. Its simplistic structure was dressed in shadow, a silhouette in the dark. I eyed the desk silently as my heart pounded in my chest. Desperately, I wanted to approach it, but was too frightened to leave my bed. My legs were frozen. Every fiber in them seemed to be locked. All I could do was sit there as the memory of my father's cold shadow crept into my mind like a dense fog crawling over the earth. Fearfully, I turned my head and looked at my father's door across the hall. It was shrouded entirely by darkness, like a tenebrous cave hidden from the light. Sweat rolled down my temples as I stared wide-eyed at the foreboding door, fearing it would suddenly swing open and I'd see my father's silhouette standing in the doorway. Anxiety gripped my throat as I turned away and looked at the clock. It was 1 minute to midnight, causing my heart to pound faster in my chest. My mind raced as I glanced back at the desk. It's just 10 words, I thought. That's it. Quickly, I looked back at my father's door, ensuring myself that it was still closed. He's got to be sleeping by now. It's just 10 words. I'll be back right quick, I thought. Suddenly, my chest tightened as I turned and looked at the clock. I watched its hands strain to midnight as the tick resounded off the walls. Slowly, I turned my head and stared again at my desk across the room. I promised. It's just 10 words, I thought. He'll never know. Nervously, I took a deep breath, then carefully lowered my feet to the floor. But as soon as I stepped onto the aging floorboards, a loud creak echoed throughout my room. My heart stopped as I froze and looked at my father's door. I listened attentively, fearing I'd hear his footsteps walk across his room. My fists were tightly clenched, and every muscle in me felt stiff. But after listening and watching for a moment, I heard nothing. So I sighed a breath of relief. I looked back at the desk and stared at the pile of papers resting on top of it. You've done this a heap of times before, I thought. Just stay quiet. Slowly, I made my way across the floor, careful not to make another creak. But with each step, my legs trembled, causing the floorboards to groan quietly under my feet. I stopped before the desk and looked down at the papers below me. Just grab them and get out, I thought, fearing my father could wake at any second. Swiftly, I grabbed 2 sheets and folded them in halves. I stuck them deep into my right pocket and snatched 2 pencils. I held the pencils tightly as I turned toward the hallway. Stay calm, I thought. You'll be all right. Nervously, I approached the hall as the stain of darkness blanketing my father's door seemed to grow. Every instinct commanded me to return to bed, but despite that, I continued forward. I took a couple of steps into the hallway, then stopped a few feet before my father's door. Immediately, the aroma of his tobacco assaulted me as I stood motionless in the hall. Attentively, I listened, ensuring myself once again that he was asleep. Just get to the stairs, I thought. He ain't awake. Slowly, I turned and walked to the staircase at the end of the hall. But as I stopped at the top of the stairs, I once again looked behind at my father's door. Every sound appeared to be intensified as I stood there frozen. The groaning house, ticking clocks, and creaking floors all seemed to form an ominous chorus, warning me not to go. But I didn't listen. Instead, I took a deep breath, looked down the staircase, then carefully descended the steps. I stopped at the bottom of the stairs and scanned my eyes across the main floor. Every inch seemed to be cloaked in darkness except for the lone ray of moonlight shining through the window of the back door. I approached the door slowly, keeping my eyes locked on the ray of light. I felt like a ship that spotted a lighthouse after being lost at sea for countless dreadful months. I stopped just before the door and lowered my hand to the knob. Slowly, I twisted it around and opened the door to the outside. I closed the door behind me as I stepped onto the damp grass. God, please help us, I silently prayed as I looked toward 10 cabins in the distance. The cabins were veiled by darkness and stood on top of a lonely hill. They overlooked a sea of cotton fields and were organized into 2 parallel rows. Nervously, I took a deep breath and squeezed the pencils in my hand. Come on, it's just 10 words, I whispered to myself. It'll be all right. Slowly, I took a step forward, fear weighing down my feet. But after taking a moment to calm myself, I ran to the hill with great haste. I stopped at the top of the hill, taking a moment to catch my breath. I sure hope he got out okay, I thought, swiping the hair away from my face. Slowly, I began walking down the path that ran between the 2 rows of log cabins. Suddenly, my heart felt heavy as I looked upon their decrepit states. Every cabin was sun-bleached and had long cavernous cracks dressed with gossamer in their walls. They all had only one glassless window with their shutters open, allowing me to see the shadows that plagued each cabin inside. It was as if the buildings were abandoned, deserted long ago, the only sign of human life being the vegetable gardens outside and the faint aroma of sweet cornbread and salted pork that kindly greeted my nose. I stopped at the end of the path and looked down the slope of the hill, focusing my eyes on a tiny shed that stood near the cotton fields below. The shed was a quarter the size of the cabins and constructed of gray aging boards. Rusted sheet metal covered its top, and it had only one cracked window. I stood there motionless, fear plaguing my thoughts. The end of my trying journey was only 10 yards away, but the temptation to turn back was stronger than ever before. I looked upon the shed, too frightened to move. Come on, it's But before I could finish my thought, I saw a figure appear behind the cracked window. My heart leapt with excitement as the person waved at me. He made it, I happily whispered as I smiled and descended the hill quickly. I swiftly approached the front of the shed and saw my best friend Moses standing in the doorway. The moon illuminated his dirty Osnaburg shirt and stained cotton breeches as he smiled brightly at me. I ran toward Moses and embraced him tightly. I was scared you were caught, 'cause I didn't see no sign of you, he whispered as he lightly patted my back. I'm sorry, Moses. I wasn't meaning to be late, I quietly replied as I released him. I was just scared of waking my father, so I had trouble getting out. Moses's smile faded as his eyes expressed deep concern. You sure he's still sleeping? He asked in a quiet, uneasy voice. The welts on my back suddenly burned as his frightening question rang in my ears. It was as if my father's switch tore open my healing wounds, warning me one final time not to do this. But as I looked into Moses's eyes, I knew what I intended to do was right. I came to that shed with a purpose far greater than the burn of my father's lash. Don't worry, I quietly answered. I'm sure I didn't wake him. Besides, it's just 10 words. I reckon we'll be done in a jiff. Moses smiled, his eyes gleaming with gratitude and relief. You're my best friend, Robby. I'll never forget this, Moses said as he embraced me once again. It's a good and right thing we're doing, Moses, I replied. Come on, let's go in. Moses let go of me, smiling from ear to ear. He patted me once on the arm, then proceeded into the shed. I followed him closely and gently closed the door behind me, causing the rusty tools hanging on the back wall to sway and lightly clink together. I looked around the shed as rays of moonlight shined through the holes in the roof, illumining the tiny specks of dust floating in the air. Moses walked across the dirt floor toward a wooden footstool in the center of the shed. Its weathered legs and rough top were illumined by rays of moonlight as if God himself was blessing our pursuit. Moses sat beside the footstool and quietly said as he looked around the shed, I'm happy we're here, Robby. I was so scared we'd never do this again. Moses looked at me as I approached him and sat beside him, his eyes appearing sorrowful and contemplative as if something was on his mind. Is something weighing on you? I quietly asked. Moses sighed and quietly answered, I'm thinking about my pa. I kept silent and watched as Moses slowly traced his fingers along the grains of the footstool, scratching the flakes of loose paint off its coarse wood. "You know my pa's dead," Moses quietly said, not raising his eyes from the footstool. "I think about that day all the time. I remember Mama holding him and crying out his name. She kept saying, 'The light left his eyes. The light left his eyes.'" Moses then slowly raised his eyes and looked at me, tears rolling down his cheeks. "But when I saw him, when I saw my pa's eyes, they look the same, Robby. They look the same." Moses stared at me, desperate for me to understand. But I was perplexed by his words, so I asked, "What are you saying, Moses?" Moses closed his eyes and lowered his head, appearing as if he was gathering his thoughts, formulating these memories into words for the very first time. "I didn't have Pa for long," Moses said, breaking the silence, "but I can see his face, his big smile. It makes me so happy, Robby. It always did." Moses then opened his eyes and looked at me with a troubled expression. But even when Pa smiled, his eyes, they never did. They always looked like they had a shadow, like a gray cloud over them. My Pa lived and died with that shadow, Robby. I don't want that shadow. I don't want it for me, and I don't want it for Mama. Moses momentarily glanced down, then raised his eyes to meet my own. They no longer appeared troubled, but were filled with determination and conviction. "I don't want to die like my Pa," Moses sincerely said. "I won't die a slave. Not me, not Mama. That's why I got to keep learning, Robby. That's why. 'Cause by learning to read and write, Mama and I will be free." Moses then fell silent and continued to look at me with great resolve. As I contemplated his words, I began to realize why Moses treasured the lessons and why, despite being punished, he so eagerly came that night. Moses was born in chains, his rights violated before he departed his mother's womb. He was made in the image and likeness of God, but treated as property, worse than an animal in a barn. But despite being immersed in such darkness, Moses never lost sight of the light. He kept his eyes on the lighthouse of freedom across the stormy sea and yearned to ride the ship of knowledge that could sail him across. Though at the time, I didn't fully see how literacy could lead to liberty. Moses did. And if Moses believed learning to read and write would lead him to freedom, I wanted to do all I could to help him. So with a renewed resolve and purpose, I extended my hand to my friend, offering him one of the pencils I had been so tightly clutching since I first smuggled them from my room. As I held the pencil before Moses, his eyes no longer expressed an angry conviction. Instead, they were filled with gratitude and the joy of not having to continue on alone. We were in this together, two brothers making their way through a fallen world. So when Moses reached out and grasped the key to his freedom, I said the only thing I could: "Let's get to it." Moses smiled as I reached into my pocket and retrieved the two folded sheets of paper. The papers had become wrinkled from the journey, but it mattered to neither of us. I handed one of the sheets to Moses and began unfolding my own. I did my best to flatten out all the creases, then rested it on the stool. "You're going to love this sentence," I said as Moses placed his paper beside mine. "It says everything you taught me," I continued. "You'll like it. You'll see." "What's the sentence?" Moses asked with excitement in his voice. "You'll see," I answered as I pressed the pencil's graphite tip onto my wrinkled sheet of paper. I wanted to surprise Moses, so I covered the paper with my hand, my childish attempt to prevent him from sneaking a peek. "Come on, let me see," Moses begged as I began writing the sentence. "No," I replied with a smile. "Wait till I'm finished." As I neared the final words, I said without taking my eyes off the paper, "I have trouble remembering it exactly, so I memorized the sentence this way." As those words departed my lips, I dramatically dotted a period at the end of the sentence. "Copy it, then read it out loud," I said as I uncovered my paper, allowing him to see it. Moses's eyes widened with excitement as he glanced down at my paper. "Come on," I encouraged him. "Take it and copy it down." Moses eagerly nodded, then reached over and slid my paper closer to his own. He pressed his pencil onto his paper and without hesitation leaned over it and began copying the 10 words. I shifted closer to Moses as I watched him write the sentence. He penned each letter with such care, vigilant to not miss the most minute of details. "You're doing good, Moses," I said eagerly, peering at his work. But Moses didn't acknowledge me. Instead, he remained silent, entirely focused on writing the sentence. My excitement grew as Moses neared the final word. "Good. Keep going," I said. "You're almost done." Moses didn't respond as he dotted a period at the end of the sentence. "Go on, read it," I encouraged him. But Moses didn't say a word. Moses looked silently down at his paper, almost appearing as if he were in disbelief as to what he had just written. "Is this for real?" Moses asked without taking his eyes off the 10 words. "What do you mean?" I asked, excited to hear what he would say. Moses lifted the paper, bringing it closer to get a better look. He studied the sentence closely, quizzically examining it. "Where'd you get this?" he eagerly asked, glancing up from his paper. "An old book I found in my father's library." Moses glanced back down and started whispering the 10 words to himself. But before he could finish reading the sentence, something outside the window caught my eye. Immediately, the blood drained from my face as I saw a silhouette with a bright torch descending the hill. "Somebody's coming," I said in a panic, my eyes wide with terror as the flames of the torch grew in my sight. Moses glanced out the window fearfully as I swiped my paper and pencils off the stool. "Rip it up," I impulsively commanded him as I tore my paper to pieces. Moses watched as I crumpled the shreds into a tiny wad. "Come on, what you waiting for?" I anxiously asked as I tossed the pencils and ball of paper to a dark corner of the shed. But Moses didn't answer as he frantically looked around, clutching the sentence close to his heart as if he were protecting it from harm. I was about to take it from him when I heard footsteps just outside the door. I could see the flickering orange flames of the torch through the cracks as the knob began slowly twisting around. I glanced at Moses as he shoved the paper deep into his pocket, concealing it from view just before the door swung open. Suddenly, the rusty hinges groaned out in pain as the hanging tools rattled together. A gust of wind blew into the shed as a towering man stood inches before the doorway. I could hardly breathe as the orange flames dimly illumined his clothes. His wide-brimmed straw hat and broad shoulders made him appear like a giant as the fog crawled over his leather boots. Every limb of mine shivered as I looked at the slave driver's weather-beaten face. His name was July, and he had served my father for many years. We sat frozen by the stool as July stood just outside the doorway. His evergreen-colored eyes almost appeared dejected, like those of a disappointed, hurt parent. "How could y'all do this?" he asked in a pained voice. "Y'all putting us in danger. Why y'all doing this?" Neither of us answered as tears welled up in my eyes. My healing wounds began to burn as I anticipated the searing pain of my father's lash. July turned to Moses and sadly asked, "Why, Moses? Why? After what happened last time? Why?" Moses didn't reply as July glared down at him. "And your mama," July quietly added. "How could you do this to her after all she done for you?" July fell silent as he looked intently at Moses through his heartbroken eyes, appearing almost like a loving father, desperate to hear even a whisper of remorse from his son. But Moses remained silent, his eyes downcast toward the dirt. His silence must have torn at July's heart. If only he had known the truth. Disappointed and left with nothing but his false perception of Moses' selfishness, July sighed and quietly said, "Get up, Moses. Come with me." Moses glanced at me, then slowly stumbled to his feet. I could see his legs trembling as he slowly approached the doorway. July grabbed his shoulder as Moses departed the shed and stood beside him. Moses nervously looked down at the grass as the flames of July's torch danced in the night. July glanced dishearteningly down at Moses, then looked at me and quietly said, "Your father's waiting for you by the cabins. He wants you to follow us there." Moses looked at me, his eyes full of fear and concern. I felt as if we had been sentenced to death, condemned to die for our crimes on the summit of that hill. I slowly rose to my feet, my legs barely able to support my weight. Dark memories swarmed in my mind as July watched me fearfully approach. As I departed the shed, July turned and led Moses toward the hill. I followed close behind, imagining the terrifying fates awaiting us both. As we began our ascent up the hill, a gust of wind rushed down its slope, bringing with it the faint sound of crying and the acrid smell of smoke. All the while, dark clouds covered the moon and stars, blanketing everything around us with an oppressive shadow. hiding away all hope. My chest could barely contain my pounding heart as we stepped onto the hill's summit. Immediately, my blood ran cold as I stopped and looked at my father up the path. His tall, haggard silhouette stood motionless before a fire, with its flames writhing and hissing in a shallow iron pot. My mouth suddenly grew dry as I saw my father slightly cock his skull-shapen head, a gesture I was all too familiar with, and caused the hairs on my neck to stand on end. I fearfully looked away from my father and continued following Moses and July up the path. I walked laggardly behind them, my legs feeling heavier with each step. As I followed Moses and July, I could sense the slaves watching us as they stood along both sides of the path. But I dared not look at them, feeling responsible for the impending punishment sure to befall my friend. My father watched me approach as Moses and July stopped before him. I could feel his fiery gaze set upon me as the wounds on my back once again began to burn. I stopped and stood beside Moses as the putrid smell of my father's tobacco assailed my nose, immediately nauseating me as the scorching heat of the fire radiated onto my face. As I stood beside Moses, I felt my father's bony hand clamp down on my shoulder like a vice. His long, cold fingers dug into my skin as he pulled me toward himself, forcing me to stand at his side. I dared not look up at him as the wheezing sound of his labored breath filled my ears. Instead, I just stood there silently, looking hopelessly at my friend. As I stood beside my father, I heard a twig loudly snap in the grass. Startled by it, I turned my head toward the sound and saw two figures emerge from the darkness. My heart wrenched as I saw Ruth being led by George, a slave driver, toward the fire. Her tired, weather-beaten features revealed her harsh life as the orange glow of the fire illuminated the wrinkles on her face. Ruth stopped beside the fire as George stood behind her with a curled whip. Her worried, teary eyes focused upon Moses as she stood silently in her coarse dress. Moses stared at Ruth, his eyes expressing fear and sorrow. His body jerked as if he wanted to run toward her and embrace her. But instead, all he could do was painfully mutter, "Mama," under his breath. My father tightened his grip on my shoulder as he raised his other hand and made a gesture. Without hesitation, George acknowledged him and sternly yelled, "Get down!" to Moses' mother. Ruth kept her eyes on Moses as she lowered herself down to her hands and knees, surrendering her back to George as he took a few steps backward and uncurled his whip. Everything seemed to grow quiet as George stood motionless for a moment behind Ruth. Even the crying babies ceased their wailings as Moses and his mother mournfully gazed at each other. My throat suddenly tightened as I watched George raise his whip. Its long tail undulated backward as it whistled in the air and snapped as it kicked back. I jerked under my father's grasp as the whip slashed across Ruth's back, making her wince in pain as she tightly clutched the dirt and grass. Tears streamed down Moses' eyes as he watched George brutally flagellate his mother. Moses trembled as the sound of each lash seemed to shake the ground like a crash of thunder. Blow after blow, strike after strike, her once light-colored dress became tattered and crimson red. Even after Ruth grew too weak to remain kneeling, the horrid flagellation didn't cease. Long after I thought that Ruth couldn't possibly survive another lash, my father finally raised his hand and gestured for the flogging to end. Over the years, my father seemed to have crafted cruelty into some sort of twisted art, knowing how much each person could endure before succumbing to death. George acknowledged my father with a weary, "Yes, master," then stepped back. Drops of blood dripped off the tail of his whip as he looked down at Ruth. I felt sickened and frightened by my father as I watched Ruth lay shivering on the blood-soaked grass. Her short, quivering breaths told of her indescribable pain, sounds that haunt my memory to this very day. Unable to endure the sight of her anguish any longer, I turned away from Ruth and looked at my friend. His bloodshot eyes were fixed on his mother as he stood motionless by July's side, fearful that any movement would reignite my father's torture of Ruth. I couldn't help but gasp as I felt my father suddenly release me, withdrawing his long fingers from my shoulder as his wheezing breaths deepened. I promptly looked down, too frightened to even catch a glimpse of his face. But as I lowered my eyes, I saw his black, scuffed boots turn toward the fire behind me. I kept my eyes down as I listened to him slowly walk up the path. His heavy boots splashed through the mud as the foul smell of his tobacco followed him, gradually fading. The blood in my head pounded as I heard him stop before the flames, the burning logs cracking and hissing in the pot as I listened to him anxiously. As I stood there frozen, the sound of a loud metallic scrape pierced my ears. "What's that?" I worriedly thought, but I was too frightened to turn around to see what it was. I heard my father turn and begin slowly walking back toward me, his footsteps causing my heart to pound as I clenched my teeth. My hands quivered as I listened to my father stop beside me, the smell of his tobacco once again potent, causing my throat to tighten. I stood there quietly, fearful to even lift my head, but something in my father's hand caught my eye. A branding iron, I fearfully thought as I looked upon the fiery red glow of its scorching hot end. My father tightened his grip around the iron's wooden handle, causing his knuckles to appear bony white. "Don't do this, Father!" I yelled in my mind as I watched him slowly raise his other hand, gesturing for July to bring my friend. My heart raced in a panic as July answered, "Yes," in a steady but quiet voice, his evergreen-colored eyes showing a glimpse of hate for my father as he handed his torch to Charles, another slave driver, and brought forth my friend. I felt utterly paralyzed as I watched Moses step before my father, his eyes wide with fear as he gazed upon the vengeful glow of the iron. I could hardly breathe as I saw July reach down and grab Moses's left wrist. His cracked, strong fingers slightly trembled as he slowly presented Moses's writing hand. My cheeks stung with tears as I heard July quietly say, "Open your hand." But Moses kept it balled in a tight fist as he stood shivering before the iron. "Moses, open your hand," July ordered again, his voice giving way to a slight quiver as he attempted to subdue his tears. I heard Moses's breath quicken as he surrendered his palm, then watched as he turned his head away and squinted his eyes shut. Time seemed to slow as my father began raising the iron. My eyes focused on Moses's hand as I remembered hearing him read his first word, his name. Suddenly, in an instant, every past lesson seemed to flash in my mind. Every smile, every struggle, and every letter and word soared past me until I was met with a final memory. What Moses told me that night. Everything around me seemed to fade as I heard Moses's powerful words replay in my head. "I won't die a slave. Not me. Not Mama. That's why I got to keep learning, Robby. That's why. 'Cause by learning to read and write, Mama and I will be free." Suddenly, a tumult of anger coursed through my veins. To me, the branding of Moses's hand placed everything he hoped for at stake. So with all my might, I yelled, "Father!" as loud as I could, raising my hand up, a desperate gesture for him to stop. My father stayed his hand, the branding iron mere moments away from burning Moses's palm. Quickly, he turned his head and looked down at me, darkness partially obscuring his face. Immediately, my anger fled as I shuddered under my father's gaze. His tall, skeletal figure turned towards me as he lowered the iron to his side, then stood motionless, staring down at me. Moses's eyes were now open and widened with shock, his hand still trembling as July kept hold of his wrist. I felt petrified, the wounds on my back tempting me not to speak. Yet despite my fears, I kept my hand up and shakily said, Please don't do this, Father. It's my fault, not his." Tears streamed down my cheeks as I looked up at my father. He was still standing motionless, silent, his dark shadow cast over me. Trembling, I stood before him, fear plaguing every thought. But I knew at that moment what had to be done, accept punishment in place of my friend. Slowly, I turned my outstretched hand until my palm faced upward, my father looking down at it as his grip on the iron tightened. Swiftly, without warning, my father reached down and grabbed my wrist, his cold fingers wrapping around my skin as I closed my eyes and turned away. I could hardly breathe as I steeled myself for the indescribable pain sure to come. "Please, God," I silently prayed, "make it not hurt." My father kept hold of my wrist as I prayed that prayer over and over. But moments passed, and suddenly, my father's grip began to weaken. Slowly, my father released me, causing my mind to fall into a panic. "No, please, me, not Moses," I thought as I opened my eyes, keeping my hand outstretched. Quickly, I turned my head, ready to shout, "Father," once again. But as soon as I looked forward, I saw him standing there, motionless, looking down at me. The two of us locked eyes, neither of us saying a word. It felt like he was peering into my soul, but what he was searching for, I did not know. My father looked at me for a moment, then glanced down at the branding iron at his side. Its once bright orange end had now cooled to a dim red. My father slightly raised the iron as it quivered in his hand. He stared at it for only a moment, then lowered the iron once again. My father kept his eyes downcast as the wind whistled past my ears, his shadow gradually receding as the fire began to die away. Nervously, I watched as my father glanced at the iron again. Then suddenly, without saying a word, he released it, allowing it to fall to the muddy path. I stood there, shocked and confused, looking down at the sizzling mud. I didn't know what to think, but a heavy sense of dread filled my heart. Slowly, I lowered my outstretched hand, unsure if I made things worse. Horrifying images of my father severing Moses' hand flashed in my mind as I began to feel guilt for my interruption. Suddenly, terror seized my throat as I saw my father's black boots turn. I imagined him reaching for his knife, about to punish Moses more severely in retribution. Fearfully, I looked up and saw my father staring down at Moses' outstretched hand. My friend's eyes were downcast as July kept hold of his shivering wrist. I could do nothing but silently pray as my father continued to look down at Moses. Each passing moment felt like an eternity as I stood there, waiting to learn my friend's fate. Suddenly, my heart dropped as I saw my father turn to July. But before I could even say another silent prayer, my father gestured for Moses to be released. I watched in disbelief as July let go of Moses' wrist. "Everybody back to your cabins," George suddenly shouted at the slaves, as July escorted Moses to his mother, who was now kneeling in the grass. My father turned away as Moses approached Ruth, her eyes expressing such pain as Moses cried, "Mama," and knelt before her. Tears streamed down Moses' cheeks as he stared into his mother's eyes. She gazed at him with such love, then reached out and embraced him. I watched Ruth hold on to Moses in a way only a loving mother can. Though her body shivered in pain, she held on to him as Moses cried in her arms. Slowly, Ruth released her son and wiped the tears away from his face. "Moses," July quietly said, "help me get her up." Moses didn't take his eyes off Ruth as he took hold of her hands. "Come on, Ruth," July said as the two helped her stand up. "I'll tend to your wounds to make you feel better." Ruth winced in pain as they slowly escorted her to her cabin. I watched them until they opened the door and disappeared inside. Nervously, I turned away after the cabin door creaked shut. It was just me and him now, standing alone on that quiet hill. I remained silent as my father kept his back to me. Though I was afraid, I felt oddly relieved. Suddenly, without saying a word, my father slowly glanced behind. At that moment, we looked at each other, and I saw that his eyes were blue for the first time in my life.
To my dearest friend, Robby. How far we have come, my friend. How far we have come. It truly is remarkable that all this started with 2 children sneaking out to a shed at night. I couldn't help but cry as I began reading your beautiful work. To read with such ease now. What a gift I have been given. And to be able to teach and share this gift with other Negroes. What a blessing. We hold this truth that all men are created equal. I am so happy I did not tear up my sheet. Those 10 words I wrote now hang on my classroom wall, there to remind all of my students that everyone, no matter their color, is made in the image and likeness of God, and to be treated with dignity. For many years, we have pondered what stayed your father's hand that night. But after reading your reflections, I think I may know what it was. Despite being punished, you still came to me that night. You risked getting lashed for teaching me to read and write, and you offered yourself to be punished in my place. The brotherly, self-sacrificing love you showed me broke through your father's heart of stone. It allowed him to truly see those 10 words, and to see us Negroes as human, equal in dignity to himself. I graciously thank you for sending me your work, and for penning your memories into words. It was such an important night. In fact, I look forward to writing my own very soon. And as for a title, how about just 10 words? I think that will paint the picture. Please give our love to your wife, Sharon, and to your children, Andy and John. My wife, Lucy, and I pray for you all every day, and my children, Abigail and Daniel, cannot wait to swim in that pond with Andy and John this summer. Mama sends you her love and insists on making supper when we visit. She's getting old now, but she has a light in her eyes that is not dimmed. And thank you once again for your generous donation to our school. We are indeed truly blessed. They are such beautiful books. May God bless you and your family. Your friend, Moses.
Thank you, everyone, for listening to Robby and Moses' story. If you'd like to hear more short stories like this one, please subscribe to the channel. And please don't forget to leave a like and a comment on this video before you go. Have a great day, and see you next time.